Why would a father abandon his son for years, leaving behind only heartbreak and unanswered questions? Or perhaps the truth isn't as it seems. When a young black boy, Elijah, steps into the courtroom, holding onto a weathered toy, his testimony threatens to unravel everything the court thought it knew about his family's painful story. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. The courtroom was packed. Veronica Hayes, a sharp-dressed woman in her mid-30s, sat confidently at the plaintiff's table. She exuded an air of righteous indignation, her lawyer by her side. Across from her sat Marcus Johnson, a middle-aged man with weary eyes and calloused hands. His discomfort was palpable as whispers floated across the room, many casting silent judgment on the man accused of abandoning his child. Veronica's lawyer began his opening statement, painting Marcus as a negligent father who hadn't contacted or financially supported his son, Elijah, in over 5 years. Pictures of a young, sad-faced Elijah were passed around the court, evoking sympathy from the jury. As the accusations piled up, Marcus's lawyer, an ambitious young woman named Rachel Pierce, rose to his defense. She asserted that Marcus had been deliberately kept away from his son by Veronica. The judge's skeptical glance suggested he wasn't convinced. The tension in the room thickened when Veronica testified. Her voice dripped with emotion as she described struggling as a single mother. "Marcus never cared," she declared. "He didn't call, didn't visit, didn't pay. I did everything alone." Marcus clenched his fists. His lips quivered as he whispered to Rachel, "That's not true. I tried. She blocked me every step of the way." The courtroom quieted as the first witness was called, Elijah himself. The courtroom fell silent as Elijah stepped forward, his small hands gripping a faded red toy car. His mother's stern gaze bore into him, but his eyes stayed locked on his father, who sat quietly, barely breathing. The judge leaned forward, his voice soft yet firm. "Elijah, can you tell us about your father?" Elijah hesitated, looking down at the toy. This was a gift from him," he said quietly. His voice trembled, but he continued. "He gave it to me a long time ago, on my birthday." Veronica shot up from her seat, her lawyer quickly pulling her back down. "He's confused," she hissed under her breath, her voice barely audible to those nearby. Marcus sat up straighter, his expression a mix of pride and anguish. Rachel leaned in and whispered, "This could be our turning point." Elijah's words cut through the tension. "I don't remember much, but I know my dad came to see me at school once. I was so happy to see him, but my mom got really mad." The room shifted uncomfortably. Veronica's lawyer stood to object. "Your Honor, the child's memory is unreliable. This line of questioning is inappropriate." The judge waved him off. "Overruled. Let the boy speak." Elijah glanced nervously at his mother before continuing. I wanted to see him more, but every time I asked, Mom got upset. She'd say he didn't love us." But his voice cracked, and he held up the toy car. "If he didn't love me, why would he give me this?" The air in the courtroom grew heavy. Rachel took the opportunity to approach Elijah. "Elijah, did you ever try to talk to your dad after that?" Elijah nodded. "I wrote letters. Lots of them. But I don't think he got them." Marcus's eyes widened. "I never got anything," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Rachel seized the moment. "Elijah, do you know what happened to those letters?" He hesitated, glancing again at Veronica. I think my mom threw them away," he whispered. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Veronica's face turned crimson as she furiously whispered to her lawyer. The judge rapped his gavel to regain order. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Elijah's revelation hung in the air. Veronica's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, fumbling with his papers. Rachel, however, maintained her composure, her eyes fixed on the judge. "Your Honor," Rachel began, "the boy's testimony raises a crucial question. If Marcus Johnson made efforts to contact his son, what prevented those efforts from reaching Elijah? The judge nodded. Proceed. Rachel approached the stand. Elijah, you mentioned your dad came to visit you at school. Can you tell us more about what happened that day? Elijah fidgeted, his fingers gripping the toy car tighter. It was during recess. I saw him through the fence. He waved at me and smiled. I ran over, but then someone stopped him. Who stopped him? Rachel asked gently. He glanced at his mother nervously before answering. It was the principal. And my mom came later. She was yelling at him. She said he wasn't allowed to see me. Gasps rippled through the audience. Veronica stiffened in her seat, her lips pursed tightly. Rachel pressed on. Elijah, did your dad say anything to you during that visit? Elijah nodded. He said he missed me, and he loved me. He gave me this car through the fence. He held up the toy again, his voice barely a whisper. Then the principal told him to leave. Rachel turned to Marcus. Mr. Johnson, did you visit your son at school that day? Marcus's voice broke as he answered. Yes. I tried. I just wanted to see him, even if it was only for a moment. Rachel nodded solemnly. Your Honor, I would like to submit into evidence Marcus Johnson's phone records. They show numerous unanswered calls to Ms. Hayes over the past 5 years. She handed the documents to the bailiff. And here, emails sent to Ms. Hayes, including one specifically requesting permission to visit Elijah at school on the date in question. The judge examined the records, his expression growing serious. Ms. Hayes, care to explain? Veronica stood, her lawyer urging her to remain seated. Your Honor, those calls were harassment. I had to block him to protect myself and my son. Rachel's voice sharpened. Protect him or control the narrative? Veronica's lawyer objected, but the judge allowed Rachel to continue. Elijah's testimony and these records suggest a deliberate effort to keep Marcus out of his son's life. But there's more. I subpoenaed security. Footage from Elijah's school on the day Marcus visited. Rachel gestured to the bailiff, who handed her a USB drive. This video will confirm Elijah's account and expose who really created the distance between father and son. The courtroom erupted with whispers. Veronica's face paled as the judge ordered the video to be played. The courtroom's collective attention turned to the screen as the bailiff inserted the USB drive. Veronica's knuckles turned white as she gripped the edge of her seat, her lawyer whispering furiously in her ear. The grainy footage flickered to life, showing the schoolyard on a sunny afternoon. Children laughed and played as Marcus approached the perimeter fence. He waved toward Elijah, who came running to greet him. The scene froze as the principal entered the frame, intercepting Marcus. The audio crackled. Mr. Johnson, you need to leave, the principal said firmly. I just want to give this to my son, Marcus pleaded, holding up the toy car. Moments later, Veronica stormed into the scene, her voice raised. What are you doing here? She demanded. You're not allowed near him. I'm his father, Marcus shouted back. I've been trying to see him for years. Veronica turned to the principal. You know the restraining order keeps him away. Call security. The footage froze again, and Rachel stepped forward. Your Honor, I'd like to note for the record that no restraining order exists. This was a fabricated claim made to remove Mr. Johnson from the premises. The judge's brows furrowed. Ms. Hayes, is this true? Veronica's face reddened. I was protecting my son. He didn't need a man like Marcus disrupting his life. Rachel's voice sharpened. Protecting him or controlling him? Because what we're seeing is not a mother shielding her child, but a deliberate effort to erase a father from his son's life. The tension escalated as Rachel continued. But we're not done. Your Honor, I've subpoenaed the principal to testify today. The courtroom doors opened, and a woman in her early 50s entered nervously. Principal Linda Carter stepped forward and was sworn in. Rachel wasted no time. Ms. Carter, do you recall this incident? Linda nodded reluctantly. Yes. I was told by Ms. Hayes that there was a restraining order against Mr. Johnson. Did you ever see such an order? Rachel asked pointedly. No, Linda admitted, her voice shaky. I trusted Ms. Hayes's word. Rachel approached the bench. Ms. Carter, were you ever instructed to block Mr. Johnson from contacting his son in any other way? Linda hesitated, glancing at Veronica. Ms. Hayes asked me not to pass along letters or messages from Mr. Johnson. She said it was for Elijah's well-being. The courtroom gasped, and Veronica stood abruptly. I did what I thought was best, she exclaimed. The judge silenced her with a sharp rap of the gavel. You'll have your chance to speak, Ms. Hayes. For now, sit down. Rachel leaned closer to Linda. Why didn't you question Ms. Hayes's motives? I didn't think it was my place, Linda confessed, her voice heavy with regret. Rachel's tone softened. Do you regret it now? Linda's eyes met Marcus's across the room. Yes, she whispered. I should have done more. Veronica sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table, her face a mask of defiance. But the murmurs in the courtroom and Principal Carter's reluctant confession had shifted the tide. Rachel, sensing the momentum, stepped forward with a determined stride. Your Honor, Rachel began, Principal Carter's testimony confirms a troubling pattern of interference. But it doesn't explain why. To uncover the truth, I'd like to call an additional witness. Veronica stiffened, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. Who could it be? She whispered to her lawyer, her voice trembling despite her composed facade. The doors opened, and a woman in her late 40s entered. Her sharp features and confident gait commanded attention as she approached the stand. The courtroom hushed as she was sworn in. Please state your name, Rachel said. Dr. Janice Blake, the woman replied. I'm a clinical psychologist and a former counselor for the Hayes family. Veronica's jaw tightened. Rachel wasted no time. Dr. Blake, you worked with the Hayes family. Can you tell us what brought them to you? Dr. Blake adjusted her glasses. Ms. Hayes came to me seeking guidance after her divorce. She expressed anger and resentment toward Mr. Johnson, describing him as unfit and a disruption to her life. Did she ever mention Elijah in these sessions? Rachel asked. Dr. Blake hesitated, then nodded. Yes. She often spoke about controlling the narrative of his relationship with his father. She believed Elijah would be better off without him. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Veronica shot to her feet. That's a lie. I never said that. The judge rapped his gavel. Ms. Hayes, sit down or I'll hold you in contempt. Rachel pressed on. Dr. Blake, did Ms. Hayes ever reveal why she was so determined to keep Mr. Johnson out of Elijah's life? Dr. Blake hesitated, glancing at Veronica, whose face had turned ashen. Yes, she said finally. Ms. Hayes admitted that her animosity wasn't entirely about Mr. Johnson's parenting. She cited concerns about societal perceptions of their family, particularly about Elijah's identity as a black boy with a black father. The room froze. Rachel let the silence hang, the weight of the words settling over the courtroom. You're saying Ms. Hayes' actions were influenced by racial bias? Rachel asked, her tone measured. Dr. Blake nodded. She expressed fears that Elijah would face challenges because of his race and believed distancing him from his father might shield him from those struggles. Marcus's hands balled into fists as he fought to contain his emotions. Elijah looked up at his father, confusion and sadness in his eyes. Rachel turned to Veronica. Ms. Hayes, do you deny these claims? Veronica's lips parted, but no words came. Her lawyer rose in desperation. Objection. This is conjecture and irrelevant to the custody case. The judge overruled the objection. Ms. Hayes, answer the question. Veronica's voice was barely audible. I just wanted him to have a better life. Rachel leaned forward, her tone cutting. And you thought that life would be better without his father? Without the man who fought every step of the way to be part of his son's life? Veronica looked down, her silence speaking volumes. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. Veronica's admission hung in the air, a damning silence that spoke louder than any denial could. Marcus's eyes never left his son, who sat clutching the toy car, his small face pale with confusion. Rachel stood again, her voice calm but piercing. Your Honor, the testimony so far has revealed deliberate interference in Mr. Johnson's attempts to connect with his son. But there's more. I'd like to introduce further evidence that sheds light on the extent of this interference. She gestured toward the bailiff, who handed her a stack of envelopes. Rachel held them up for the court to see. These are letters Marcus Johnson wrote to his son, Elijah, over the past 5 years. They were never delivered. Veronica's lawyer shot to his feet. Objection. Where did these letters come from? This evidence wasn't disclosed prior to trial. Rachel anticipated the challenge. Your Honor, these letters were retrieved from Ms. Hayes's property under a lawful subpoena issued last week. They were found discarded in a storage box in her garage. The judge reviewed the documents Rachel presented and nodded. Overruled. Proceed. Rachel turned back to Veronica. Ms. Hayes, do you recognize these? Veronica's face flushed, her lips trembling. I might have seen them, but they were just words. Promises he couldn't keep. Rachel's voice hardened. You didn't think your son deserved the chance to read them? To decide for himself if they were just words? Elijah's small voice broke through the silence. Letters? From Dad? Rachel knelt to his level, her voice gentle. Yes, Elijah. Your dad wrote to you, but you never got to read them. Would you like to hear one? Elijah nodded slowly. The courtroom watched as Rachel unfolded one of the letters and began to read aloud. Dear Elijah, I miss you every day. I think about you when I wake up and before I go to bed. I hope you're happy and doing well in school. I want you to know I'm proud of you, even if I can't tell you in person. One day, I'll be able to see you again, and we'll make up for all this lost time. I love you with all my heart. Love, Dad. Tears streamed down Marcus's face as Elijah looked up at him, his own eyes welling with tears. You wrote that for me? Marcus nodded, his voice breaking. Every single one, son. I never stopped trying to reach you. Elijah turned to his mother, his small hands shaking. Why didn't you let me see them? Why, Mom? Veronica struggled to respond, her voice faltering. I thought it was better this way. I didn't want you to be disappointed. Elijah's voice cracked as he whispered. I wasn't disappointed. I was hurt. I thought Dad didn't care about me. The room fell silent, the raw emotion in Elijah's words cutting through every heart present. Elijah's words hung in the air, their raw pain cutting through the tension in the courtroom. Veronica sat frozen, unable to meet her son's tearful gaze. Marcus, still kneeling beside Elijah, held his son tightly, his voice trembling. Elijah, I wrote to you every chance I got. I never stopped trying. Rachel stood again, her tone resolute. Your Honor, we have evidence that supports Mr. Johnson's claims of consistent efforts to contact his son. Alongside the letters, we found a ledger showing every delivery Marcus attempted to send to Elijah, many of which were intercepted. The judge gestured for her to proceed. Rachel retrieved a stack of documents and approached the bench. These are receipts and tracking numbers from a local delivery service. Each corresponds to packages sent to Ms. Hayes's address over the past 5 years. Many were marked as refused or unclaimed. The courtroom stirred with whispers as the judge examined the evidence. Veronica's lawyer stood abruptly. Objection. This is irrelevant to custody. Ms. Hayes was under no obligation to accept these packages. Rachel's eyes flashed. Your Honor, it's not about obligation, it's about intent. These actions demonstrate a deliberate effort to block communication and connection between Elijah and his father. The judge raised a hand to silence the growing tension. Overruled. Continue. Rachel approached the jury, holding one of the packages, its label faded but intact. This package, for example, was sent 2 years ago. Inside, you'll find a handmade scrapbook of family photos, letters, and notes Marcus compiled for Elijah. She opened the box carefully, displaying the lovingly crafted pages. Elijah's breath hitched as he saw pictures of himself as a baby, held in his father's arms. "You kept these?" he whispered to Marcus, his voice cracking. "Every moment I could," Marcus replied. "I wanted you to know how much you've always meant to me." Rachel continued, her tone unyielding. "Ms. Hayes, why would you refuse such a package? What harm could it have done to let Elijah see his father's love for him?" Veronica's voice wavered. I thought it would confuse him. I was trying to protect him from disappointment." Rachel's expression hardened. "Or were you protecting your version of the story? You denied your son the chance to decide for himself. Instead, you planted doubt and resentment." Veronica looked at Elijah, her voice breaking. "I was wrong. Elijah, I'm so sorry." Elijah wiped his eyes, his young voice steady despite his tears. "I wanted him, Mom. I needed him. You didn't let me have him." The courtroom remained silent as the echoes of Elijah's heartbroken words lingered in the air. Marcus reached out to his son with trembling hands, but the bailiff gestured for him to stay seated. The judge took a deep breath, visibly moved by the scene unfolding before him. Rachel stood, her tone unwavering but compassionate. "Your Honor, the letters were not the only attempts Marcus Johnson made to connect with his son. We have further evidence that shows a pattern of interference." Another gesture to the bailiff brought in a box, worn and slightly dusty, with Elijah's birthday written across it in faded marker. Rachel held the box up for the court to see. This box, along with several others, was found in the same storage unit as the letters. It contains gifts Marcus sent to Elijah over the years, gifts that were never delivered. Elijah's eyes widened as Rachel opened the box. Inside were carefully chosen items, books, toys, and even a handmade card with Marcus's handwriting. "This," Rachel said, holding up a small basketball, "was for Elijah's 8th birthday. Mr. Johnson sent it after hearing his son had started playing basketball at school." Veronica shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "He was never going to follow through," she muttered, barely loud enough for the court to hear. But Rachel caught it. "Never follow through, Ms. Hayes? These aren't the actions of a father who doesn't care. They're the actions of a man who was trying, against every obstacle, to stay in his son's life." The judge looked over his glasses at Veronica. "Ms. Hayes, do you dispute that these gifts came from Mr. Johnson?" Her lawyer intervened quickly. "Your Honor, my client doesn't dispute the gift's origin. However, her decisions were guided by what she believed was best for her son at the time." Rachel stepped closer to the bench. "Best for her son, or best for herself?" "Your Honor, this isn't about protecting Elijah, it's about control." Ms. Hayes's actions systematically erased Marcus from Elijah's life, leaving her to dictate every narrative. Elijah stood suddenly, his voice rising with a mix of frustration and heartbreak. "Why, Mom? Why didn't you tell me about the gifts? Why did you keep them from me?" Veronica turned to her son, tears streaming down her face. "I thought I was protecting you. I didn't want you to get your hopes up and be let down." "But he didn't let me down," Elijah shouted, his small frame trembling with emotion. "You did." The courtroom gasped, and Veronica crumpled into her seat, her head in her hands. Marcus, with the judge's permission, was finally allowed to approach the witness stand where his son stood. Kneeling, he looked Elijah in the eyes. "I never stopped loving you, son. I tried so hard to be there. I'll spend the rest of my life making this right if you let me." Elijah threw his arms around his father, sobbing into his shoulder. Marcus held him tightly as the courtroom watched in stunned silence. The courtroom was charged with emotion as Marcus held Elijah tightly, their bond undeniable. But Rachel knew the case wasn't over yet. The jury needed more than heartfelt moments. They needed irrefutable proof. Rachel stood, holding a file in her hand. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit one final piece of evidence, financial records that refute Ms. Hayes' claims about Mr. Johnson's lack of support." Veronica's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection. These records weren't disclosed during discovery." Rachel anticipated the objection. "Your Honor, these records were obtained in direct response to Ms. Hayes' testimony regarding financial neglect. They are directly relevant to this case." The judge nodded. "Overruled. Proceed." Rachel handed the documents to the bailiff, who distributed copies to the judge and opposing counsel. "These are bank statements showing regular child support payments made by Mr. Johnson to an account held by Ms. Hayes. The payments total nearly $20,000 over 5 years." The courtroom murmured as Veronica's lawyer quickly scanned the documents. "Your Honor, my client denies ever receiving these payments. There must be a mistake." Rachel's lips curved into a faint smile. "No mistake, Your Honor. These payments were made to an account linked directly to Ms. Hayes. Furthermore, we subpoenaed records showing withdrawals from this account coinciding with luxury purchases unrelated to Elijah's care." Veronica's face turned pale as Rachel continued. "For example, $1,200 for a spa weekend, $800 for a designer handbag. These transactions contradict the claim that Ms. Hayes was financially struggling to raise Elijah without Mr. Johnson's help." The judge's brow furrowed as he looked at Veronica. "Ms. Hayes, do you have an explanation for this?" Veronica stood, her composure finally cracking. I needed those things. Being a single mother is hard, and Marcus was never there for us emotionally." Rachel seized the moment. "So you admit to using the child support funds for personal expenses, all while claiming Mr. Johnson abandoned his responsibilities?" Veronica hesitated, her lips trembling. "I did what I had to do." Rachel stepped closer to the jury. "What Ms. Hayes had to do was ensure Elijah grew up knowing his father loved him, not fabricate a narrative to cut him out of his life. What Mr. Johnson did was everything within his power: letters, gifts, visits, and financial support, all blocked by Ms. Hayes' actions." The judge leaned forward, his tone grave. "Ms. Hayes, this court does not take lightly the obstruction of a parent's rightful relationship with their child. Do you have anything further to say before I make my decision?" Veronica glanced at Elijah, whose tear-streaked face was buried in Marcus's chest. Her shoulders slumped as the weight of her choices bore down on her. "I thought I was doing what was best," she whispered. The courtroom was still, every eye on the judge as he reviewed the evidence and testimonies. Marcus held Elijah close, his heart pounding as he awaited the decision that could change their lives forever. Veronica sat slumped in her chair, her once confident demeanor now replaced with quiet remorse. The judge adjusted his glasses, his voice heavy with gravity. "This case has revealed a troubling pattern of interference and manipulation. Ms. Hayes, your actions not only deprived Mr. Johnson of his parental rights, but also deprived Elijah of the love and support of his father. The court does not condone such behavior." Veronica's face fell, her eyes glistening with tears. The judge turned to Marcus. "Mr. Johnson, your persistence in maintaining a relationship with your son despite these obstacles demonstrates your unwavering commitment to him. The evidence shows you have acted responsibly and with your son's best interests at heart." He paused, his gaze sweeping the courtroom. "It is the ruling of this court that primary custody of Elijah will be awarded to Mr. Marcus Johnson. Ms. Hayes will retain visitation rights, contingent on her compliance with this court's orders to foster a healthy co-parenting relationship." Gasps filled the room, and Marcus closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the relief washing over him. Elijah clung to him tightly, whispering, "I'm so glad, Dad." But before the gavel could fall, Veronica stood abruptly, her voice trembling. "Your Honor, may I say something?" The judge gave her a wary nod. "Proceed." Veronica stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly together. "I made mistakes, terrible ones. I was angry, bitter, and scared. I thought keeping Elijah to myself would protect him. But I see now that I was wrong. I let my fear of losing him cloud my judgment, and I hurt both of them in the process." She turned to Marcus, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry. For everything. Elijah deserves you in his life, and I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." The courtroom held its breath. Marcus, though still reeling from the years of pain she'd caused, nodded slowly. "Elijah deserves both of us in his life, Veronica. Let's make it right for him." The judge's voice cut through the emotion. "Ms. Hayes, your willingness to accept accountability is noted. I encourage both parents to work together to rebuild trust for Elijah's sake." Court is adjourned. The gavel struck, and the room erupted in murmurs. Marcus knelt before Elijah, his voice thick with emotion. "We're going to be okay now, son. I promise." Elijah hugged him tightly, his small voice filled with hope. "I know, Dad. I know." If this story moved you, share it with someone who might need a reminder of the power of forgiveness and the importance of family. Let's start a conversation about healing broken relationships and fighting for what truly matters. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that inspire and touch the heart. Together, we can spread hope and positivity, one story at a time.